Welcome, welcome. It's 7 o'clock, so we want to honor your time and David and Matt's time as well. So I'm Debbie Dillion. I am the horticulture agent here in the extension office. And you're in for a treat. I think a lot of you already know our speaker tonight, David Blackley. And he's got a helper. Matt Williams, is that correct, Matt? Okay. So if you didn't check in on the sign-in sheet back there by Nancy in the back, please do. That's our record of your attendance. There's also a handout back there with all of the handouts that David and Matt sent us about what they're going to talk about tonight. And there's information about our plant sale coming up March the 2nd. There's a flyer back there for that. And on the back side of it, picked up one of those, is our successful gardener schedule for the rest of the year. So see what our other topics are coming up for the rest of the year. So I want to introduce David Blackley. He's a native. And more specifically, he grew up in Matthew. So if you don't know where Renfrow's hardware is, Matthew, you're missing out. It's an old hardware store. It's just awesome to go in. David began his career with Renfrow Hardware, ultimately becoming the owner. Today, it's a hardware store with a focus on farming and gardening supplies, including very extensive seed collection. So if you need seeds for your vegetable garden or flowers, they're the place to go. With decades of farming and gardening experience, David brings his experience, knowledge, and resources to gardeners of all interests and experience levels. So I'm going to clip this little thing on David and turn it over to you.
Find your name and check it out. This will you fill this out. You of a tree.
If you have trouble, and then if the whole lot of people can't hear you, it's an idea. Thank you for the invitation. Matthew and I are glad to be here. This is a great facility. I've been here over the years. My friend Jeff Reeves used to be here. We did a lot of things with him. When I do this event in Mecklenburg County, I feel like I'm on the scout camp. Here, I feel like I'm at the Ritz or something. This is a great facility. Got these surrounding areas. So tonight, I just want us to have some fun and talk about the same kind of things we talk about a lot at work when we're entering this season. And this particular topic will be how to grow fruits, berries, nuts in your backyard. And why would we want to do that? One thing, and we're going to sort of gear towards the homeowner type scale. The biggest reason we have found that people are trying to grow these are for the health reasons. You want to have a good tasting raspberry or blackberry or fig, you know, that have to grow. It's very difficult to buy good fresh fruits. They have to be really high to be good. So that's one of the reasons. The second reason is just for the fun of learning how to do something like that, like your grandparents did, and have a muscadine vine or something, and to involve children. We're real advocates for children. My favorite grandchildren, my only grandchildren, are Matt's children. I love teaching the kids to get involved in watching raspberry or grape or something. And then also the kinds of plants we're going to talk about tonight can be really nice landscape plants, because a lot of gardeners don't have a lot of room to work with, and they may have to use their front yard, and they have to use side yard, and use one of their neighbors. They may have to use backyards at the common boundary area with the neighbors. So you don't want to make a gum, you don't want to make a snake infested area, but these kinds of plants we're going to talk about tonight are practically landscape plants. You certainly, or if you're like everybody else now, you certainly are interested in growing something that is not going to require a lot of pesticides, a lot of sprays. The organic type fruits are pretty easy to grow and stick with the right varieties. And the low maintenance fruits and berries are also pretty expensive. So we're going to concentrate on what we call the low hanging fruits. And we're going to work on what is the simplest.
If you fill this out, there's going to be a raffle at the end.
A minus or A plus berry nut growers. maybe somebody comes in at least for us, and we don't sell all of them, we talk about like at the harvest, or we sell the ones that are better suited for more urban gardening. First thing we ask people is, do you have a lot of sunlight? Maybe we do a lot of things. You have enough sunlight that you've got to wear sunglasses to read the newspaper for a lot of the day, maybe 6 or 8 hours a day. Really sort of blinding light where you almost need sunscreen. Typically, these kinds of fruits and berries are perennials. They're not annuals, so they need sun not only in the summer, but they need some sun even in the winter when the sun is down behind your house for half the day in the winter and you're not getting much sun on the north side of your house, then that's not a place, it's not a growth, some of these fruits. So we constantly are asking people, well, exactly where are you going to put these? Maybe take a picture, maybe bring a video, iPad, and say, well, this is where it is.
Okay. All right.
is so important. And then you not only will learn when you think with your children and everybody else. And so the harvesting techniques you'll learn after the first year. It's almost like learning how to pick a tomato at the right time. The post-harvest handling is important. Some things you put in the freezer, some things you don't, some you can leave on the windowsill, and we won't get into the minutia of it unless there's questions of it, but it's not hard. Everybody's grandparents or great-grandparents grew a lot of these kinds of fruits, and they didn't even have refrigeration a lot of those days. As far as if you get a bounty enough that you're gonna can or freeze or make jams or something, that's great, but concentrate on eating fresh at your stage if you're beginning at it, because that's where you're gonna get the most pleasure, and you can also give away to other people. Most of these perennial type fruits are either self-fertile or require not much pollination from insects or wind, whereas the non-low hanging fruits do require more insects. If you're going to get into apples or peaches or pears or cherries or plums, which we'll talk about, not so much peaches, but a lot of these plants have a little difficult time now making fruits because we're sort of short on bees, at least in Mecklenburg County we are, and they're not easy to hand pollinate. A lot of people will plant an apple tree and 5 years later or 7 years later, they're still not getting anything, and they don't realize that, number one, they didn't plant one that was a pollinator receptor, and number two, they don't have any neighbors with bees, and now they've wasted 5 or 6 years, and they've got a disease-ridden apple tree that's got cedar apple rust or something like that. So again, these low-hanging fruits we're talking about, the blueberries, the figs, the raspberries, the goji berries, they are much more self-pollinating, or at least not as picky, and they're perfectly suited for homeowners. There are a few varieties that you have to know whether something's female or self-pollinator. Certain grapes, muscadines and scuppernons, which are our native grapes here, some of those varieties have to have a husband, so to speak. So we keep them segregated. So if you want this particular female variety, you're gonna have to have another one. So in your planning of these berries and fruits and all, count on some of them needing to have two. If your space is really limited, stick to a pomegranate or a fig or something that doesn't require a pollen. Any questions so far? But this is going to be drinking from fire hose. We'll need to cover a lot of territory, but we'll have a lot of time at the end for questions. Any questions so far for what we've covered? Okay. Sort of follow my notes here. Soil is key. Soil is important. We've talked about the clay. It's beneficial. Don't worry so much about it if you don't have clay. If you got that yellow clay, which some of us have, that's not quite as good as the red clay. Don't dig holes and work your clay when it's wet. If you've had a big rain, that's not the time to go and plant, because when you do dig with that shovel or you dig with a tiller, you're going to glaze that clay, and it's going to make it hard and make it impervious to moisture for a while. So if you're thinking about planting an area and you've got your garden hose area laid out or whatever you've approved, if you're starting from long, mow it down, scalp it down, maybe scratch it, maybe fluff it so the air will start to dry it. But don't go digging your holes until it's warm enough and dry enough that you can't just squeeze it and make a mud clod that you're going to throw at somebody, because oxygen has to move through soil. And if you're not going to have good aeration and oxygen going to these roots, you're going to suffer for a long time. And that's why we make flower pots and bricks in this state, because our clay can really become tight and almost water impervious. So work it when it's not so wet. Add compost. If you're going to use any fertilizer, just use organic fertilizer. You don't need to use 10-10-10 and 5-10-10, because too many people damage plants. And when you're planting a plant like this and it's got roots that are already exposed, and you take that out, you don't want that fertilizer to hit this stuff, and it all helps. So stick to what's going to be sort of meat and potatoes and not caffeine and sugar. I'm also not a big fan of the the blue and the purple powders, Miracle Grow, Peters, all that stuff, we sell it, but I'm not a big fan of spraying that with, on these kind of plants, because it's not really helping the soil. It might make the plant look better, but it's so important to keep the soil healthy. Once you planted these, you're gonna need to maintain that soil. Every time you eat a blueberry or you take away a fruit, you're taking away minerals from the periodic chart. You're taking away calcium and iron and magnesium, all these things that you want in your body. You're taking it out of your soil, and if you're not replenishing it, it's gonna begin to look like they used to call worn out cotton land, where they grew cotton too long and it just depleted the soil. So the way to replenish is with compost and with just some organic fertilizer. Every few years, you might want to do a soil test, send it off to NC State again. They may say, look, you're a little low on calcium, or you're needing magnesium sulfate, which helps with photosynthesis. So get that blood work done every 5 or 10 years, unless you're just successful from the get-go, because plants do require some maintenance, and it inevitably is a soil condition. A healthy soil will have a healthy plant, and you won't have the insects and the diseases if it's not struggling. But compost, particularly wood stir compost, has about everything you need in it. So if you can find some wood somewhere and go and take your leaf blower, blow the leaves out of the way, and get some of that black soil, just a 5-gallon bucket worth, and every year put a handful or two around each of your plants, you're not only adding organic matter, but you're inoculating that soil with the living organisms that live in the forest or live in the prairie, and you're gonna make your soil healthy, make your soil alive. You gotta keep on moving here. Deer, or a big issue. Deer protection is I'm sure just as important for you all as it is in Mecklenburg County. There are some plants you can plant that are deer resistant. For instance, I've never had any deer eat any of my pomegranates. They'll go up and sniff it and they'll walk away. Now, somebody might have that problem. I've seen them occasionally eat the blossom of the pomegranate, the big, beautiful red blossom, which incidentally is a beautiful landscape tree, a pomegranate is. But deer can avoid that, and you can have lots of fruits. The deer are not too bad on blueberries unless you've got too many deer. Your blueberries will do okay, but deer do like blackberries and raspberries. So if you can maybe plant them in an area that you've got a dog, or you've got children and noise or floodlights or something, or you can use netting. Now this is netting that goes over crops, and you would net it about a week before they're ripe. You don't net something at the very beginning of the season, because all the plants grow up through the netting and you can't pull it off. You just got to cut it off. But netting is one way to avoid the deer, besides variety selection. Another is just electric fence wire. Believe it or not, that will usually keep them out. And if you're not too worried about neighbors or grandchildren or something, a hot wire will do wonders, and you don't have to use it very long. But if you notice deer beginning to use your yard as one of their paths, you're going to need to break that cycle if you can. Squirrels are terrible to steal peaches and apples and pears. That's another reason that I'm not a big fan of those kind of fruits, is because they'll get them about 3 days before they're ripe. And the deer will stand on their hind legs and pull all your fruits off your trees. Whereas they don't much eat figs, they don't much eat the pomegranates, they don't much eat the briary bushes, enough that you can tolerate. Diseases, which you would use fungicide for, are just not a problem with these. Diseases are a problem with apples and peaches, particularly. If you're the type that doesn't like to spray 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 times a season, then again, stick to the plants that we're going to be talking about tonight when we get into a little more detail. Because if you're trying to grow peaches, you're going to have maybe 1 year out of 5 where you actually get a good crop without doing spraying. It's more of a problem now than it was 20 or 50 or 60 years ago, because the diseases just seem to be more prevalent. And you can read all the magazines and all the glowing catalogs that come in January and say, oh, these are disease resistant. They're not. You're gonna have to do some spraying if you get into those kinds. Some of the plants that you would be tempted to plant, again, apples particularly, would be dwarf, semi-dwarf, or standard size. Just know that you want to do your research on that, and typically, I have found that even a dwarf pomegranate isn't worth the space it's taken up. You either need a semi-dwarf or a standard plant to get enough fruit to make it worthwhile, and a standard apple tree is pretty big, if you haven't seen one. A pecan tree, you would only probably plant one in this whole room, no more than two. They take a lot of space. So back to what we said earlier, know what your mature plant size is before you get into that. Think about it, how many commercial apple orchards do you go on in Mecklenburg or Union County, or I guess the closest peach orchard might be down at Mackley down here, but those kinds of fruits just don't grow in our climate. They're either in Lincoln or Asheville, or if it's apples, or they're maybe in Mackley or some of the sand hills, the peaches. There's a reason for that. It's primarily soil and climate, but our nights are too hot here for apples to do well. You sort of need to have cool nights and hot days, and the disease persistence is just too great. So again, sort of stick with what's going to make you successful before you tackle the tough ones. Any questions so far? And I guess the people online can hear me. I've never done them online. The only time I've ever done this was as I said, was some dysfunctional church meetings during COVID that nobody knew what they were doing. It was pretty tough. Yes, ma'am.
There's a question online, somebody wants to know how to keep squirrels out of containers in kindergarten.
The question is, how do you keep squirrels out of container gardens? You can eliminate squirrels. We won't be talking about how to do that, but you can certainly try to eliminate squirrels. There's a whole school of thought that way. Feeding a squirrel off property doesn't work. Don't count on that. Not all squirrels will do that. So if you hate every squirrel, you're not problem with that. But the only thing I have found is plants that just are not attractive to squirrels. You're not going to win. An average acre of semi-wooded suburban land can have 10 to 15 squirrels that claim that as part of their territory. So it's a tough battle. And that's why we mentioned the squirrels here. They will get every peach you'll ever grow. And unless you're just Farmer McGregor out there watching your place all the time, it's kind of a hopeless thing. It's easier to control a deer than it is a squirrel. Squirrels got climbing gear. They can climb anywhere. Raccoons and possums are pretty bad. Possums are bad to steal figs, believe it or not. They do it at night, but they don't get many, and they're lazy, so they don't destroy. That's not a very good answer, but there's just not much way. The squirrel repellents that you can sprinkle out, we've got, and you can spray. They're only a repellent. They're not a sure bet, and once you get 2 or 3 rains on it, they're not very effective. Hot pepper, garlic, all the sort of home remedies, you'll do that about 1 season in your life, and then you'll just give up, and you'll just say, let's plant something that's squirrels nice. I'm all for low maintenance.
Do plums require a companion for pollination?
Some plums do, but most don't. But you really got to do your homework on plums. There are a couple of categories of plums, and you also need to know what the chilling hour requirements are for those kinds of fruits. Chilling hours are sort of complicated. It's like how many hours have been between 32 and 45 or something, and then if you get some 60-degree days, you take off half of an hour. It's basically here we're sort of 500 to 1,000 chilling hours, because we got customers that are sort of spread all over. But plums get diseases, and they get the curculio moth. I don't know if I'm saying it, but there's a little moth that makes a hole, that makes a sunken sort of a rotten spot on the plums, and they're tough. Don't do plums until you've at least mastered blueberries and pomegranates and some of those, so that your ego is good and that you know what fresh you can get. They're tough. Now the wild plums, they're pretty cool, and you can find those, and sometimes you can dig up a wild plum and be successful with it. But a Santa Rosa or some of these specialty plums, that's why they grow them in California. Incidentally, if you ever buy a plum or a peach or a nectarine you sure better wash it a lot, because those have been sprayed multiple times with, particularly with fungicide and insecticides. And a lot of people even recommend that you peel them and not eat the skin. That's why you don't see many organic plums or organic peaches, because they're ugly and they're small. Now, I've got a plum that Steve Price here grows in my neighborhood. It's a Union County plum, and it sometimes does pretty well. It was from his grandparents. So sometimes you can find an heirloom plum, and if you find one that's doing well for a neighbor, try to get a cutting or a sucker off the roots and try that. But plums are tough. You'll be disappointed, and then you come home from work and they're all gone. Someone's eating them all. Any other questions from the online people?
Somebody asked about
Pawpaws, they're pretty deep. Again, Steve, my friend Steve and I, we've eaten a few and watched a few. Pawpaws are a native fruit. It's sort of a custardy banana taste thing that looks like this. They grow in the woods. If you ever find a patch of pawpaws, the leaves kind of smell like creosote. And you'll see this tree and think, what is that tree? It doesn't really look like a dogwood leaf, but it's a familiar enough leaf, like a sourwood leaf, but you gotta catch them at just the right time. There's about 1 or 2 days that they're worth harvesting. They got great big old seeds in them. Sometimes you can successfully propagate those seeds. They've got to be scarified. You got to put them in a cooler for a while and that sort of thing. There are some, I think it's University of Kentucky that's done the most research. There are some pawpaws that are domesticated pawpaws that are coming on the scene that have some promise. It is a cool tree, and it is something that if you're shady or you've got a north bank in the woods, that you can start a patch. They're mostly clones. Pawpaws kind of grow by roots and come up. And they say you need to have 2 different plants in the same patch, so they're not exactly the same, where you won't get pollination. I've found pawpaw patches, huge pawpaw patches in the woods before, not fruit on them. And it makes me think that one seed got dropped there and it was 50 years ago and they sort of spread. But pawpaws are pretty cool. You're not going to be putting much in the freezer. You're not going to be doing anything other than having a novelty tree, but it is a good woodland type fruit, one of the few that I'm aware of. We talked a little bit about chilling hours and some of these diseases, but there again, peaches, apples, pears, you kind of really got to do your homework on these variety choices. There are a few, like a Golden Delicious, that usually will pollinate itself. You got to have the insects. You got to have sort of paired varieties that work well together. You really need to stick to either standard size or signature dwarf to get much. And you got to count on doing some spraying. There are some organic fruit tree sprays. This one is basically pyrethrins and neem oil. Y'all might be familiar with those. They're actually derived from something that once was alive. Pretty effective, but you got to use it often, because these organic sprays break down in ultraviolet light. They break down just over time pretty quickly, whereas a synthetic orchard spray that would have malathion or cactan or something in it will last a lot longer. But that's what you're getting when you buy it at the grocery store. So what's the point of spraying your own if you're trying to grow something that does not have the residue on it? But it can be done, and you certainly can grow an apple or a peach or a pear if you're willing to spray it. Some of them, the plums, you almost need to spray in the fall for a particular moth. But if you're not spraying by Valentine's Day and spraying through fruits that are about the size of a ping pong ball several times, you're going to be disappointed. You're not going to get much. And then you're going to have these beautiful peaches and apples, and the squirrels will get them all while you're at church one day or something. It always happens. Okay, pecans are a little bit different. I mentioned how big they grow. Pecans come in a big, deep pot. They've got sort of a taproot. Typically, pecans need 2 different varieties to get the right pollination. And the tags on them will tell you what a good variety is. If you've got a neighbor with a nice big pecan, chances are very good you could just plant one. If you've got one within sight, they pollinate kind of like oak trees. They have catkins and the pollen floats around. So that's fine. You're going to wait about 12 years before you get a pecan. And then then after about 20 or 25 years, it's gonna start dropping big old limbs all the time. And so don't put your children's swing set or don't park your truck under one. We broke the windshield out of our truck at our little farm. We have a neighbor that's got a big pecan that was hanging over the parking line. Busted the top out of our pickup truck and broke the windshield. Just on a beautiful, normal day, just no idea at all. So that's a very brittle wood. So that's one of the issues with pecans. They don't, you don't prune them exactly. You could get a guy with a chainsaw to climb up and sort of cut them, but pecans need to be grown out in the country, and they need to be grown in a big yard where you're not going to be parking up and letting your kids play in them. And then they're fine. Then all you got to do is fight squirrels, which they win. Okay, let's see. We gotta keep on moving. Any questions so far? Yes.
Okay, so dealing with property lines, I
Mhm.
have pictures of different pots, but where the root system can out of the property, moving up that street. How big is the root system from those properties?
Pretty big. We actually grew.
Repeat the question.
No, the question is, how big is the root system on these? Can you put it in a container? If you're worried about it getting into your neighbor's property, or if you're worried about it getting into your septic field, or if you're worried about it lifting up your chicken house or something like that. Most of these have pretty extensive root systems. We have successfully grown the berries in containers at work. We do it on purpose. We've got sort of 25-pound buckets. You can do pretty well with raspberries and blackberries in the container, and it's contained, and you can also prune them back every year so that your bush that's above ground can be whatever size you allow it to be. Every now and then you got to pull it out of the pot and root prune it a little bit. When you get into something that's going to be bigger, like a pomegranate or a Japanese persimmon, or even a big blueberry, you're going to be disappointed after a while in a container. Containers are better suited for annuals, herbs, vegetables, that sort of thing. The dwarf pomegranate we toyed with a few years, they look cool in the pot. It's a nice landscape plant, but you get about 7 pomegranates, whereas a big pomegranate you get 100. So it all goes back to whether you're really looking for food or you're just looking for a novelty and a nice landscape bush to have on your patio. We've tried growing blueberries before, but to really get good quality blueberries, you need to have a trio. You need to have 3, an early, mid, and a late variety. At least that is the case with rabbit eyes, which you grow here. And having 3 pots, you might as well have three pieces in the ground. Now, blueberries are very shallow rooted, and they won't get into a septic field nearly like a fruit tree would. So if you're looking to plant something that's not going to cause root problems, blueberries would be a good choice. Any of the blackberries, raspberries are, because remember, you're going to cut them way back every couple of years. And when you cut off a big plant up here, the roots slough off a lot underground. You can also root prune those kinds, so that if your fence row is over there, you just take the double every so often and prune them. You would be shocked that a lot of those roots are only about that far down. You can dig back and find them. But that's a good question. But these kinds of things. Now one other category is completely different, and we'll talk about in a little while, is lemon. Lemon needs to be in a container. This is a Meyer lemon, because it has to be mobile. You have to have it on wheels, so you can roll it in your garage when it's below 40 degrees. You can roll it out every day, even in the winter, that it's above about 38 or 40 degrees. 25-gallon pot, one of these, in a couple of years you'll get lemons, and in 3 or 4 years you'll get 100 lemons off of it. Beautiful, wonderful lemons like you never see at the grocery store, and it only can be grown in a container. If you've got a deck and you can drag it in your sunroom or your kitchen, that's okay too, but it has to move, because the lemon needs to think it's living in Florida. Even in January, it needs to get a lot of sun, and it needs to have pollinators even in the winter, because our lemon at work, which we call our pet, it's about 30 years old. The bees are coming to it even now, because it's blooming now for its first crop, and then it does a second crop. So if you like containers, lemon is your choice for some of these berries, but not something that's going to get very big. All goes back to what's the adult size of the. Good question, though. I would think a goji berry would probably do pretty well in a container. Goji berry is sort of a new kid on the scene. It's a European, some of them from Russia, but it's a little small berry that people love that make smoothies. Because you can buy goji berries that are dried, and you can sometimes buy fresh ones. They don't have a lot of taste, but they're super high in antioxidants and vitamin C, and I think the goji would do fine in a container. And you wouldn't have to take it, it could stay out. So let's talk about the low-hanging fruits, the good stuff, now that we've kind of gotten the negativity out of the way. My favorite, of course, are blueberries. I think there should be a law that everybody has 3 blueberries in their yard. They're beautiful landscape plants. They do drop their leaves mostly in the winter, but they look so good. They've got beautiful fall foliage that's red. They don't have briars, so kids love them. A rabbit eye, after 5 or 10 years, will be sort of about this size. You can make a hedge, you can put them in a triangle. As long as they're pretty close together, the pollination works. They can be fresh, they can be dehydrated, you can freeze them, you can make jams. They're very useful. And you can buy blueberries year round at the grocery store, I know that, but you see where most of South America or somewhere like that. There's no reason you can't grow rabbit-eye blueberries anywhere in this county or Mecklenburg County. They can take a little bit of shade if you don't have a lot of sun. They can take full sun. They like clay soil, amend it just like we talked about earlier. Don't lime it. They like acid soil, and use something like Hollytone fertilizer for it, and you're done. There's no staking. Rarely do you prune them. Commercial people prune blueberries. You can plant. We've got a big patch of them at our family lake house that's on Lake Norman. It's probably 40 years old now. My brothers and I got tired of mowing grass when we were trying to go to the lake and go fishing. So my brother planted a big old, all along the lake, a big old patch of blueberries, and they're huge. They're this big. And we could literally fill a back and pickup truck with berries. They all go to waste. We all pick all we could possibly eat, and there's still so many, even the birds and the deer, and they're very attractive. So blueberries are just so easy. We don't fertilize them maybe every 5 years. We just blow the leaves down. That's it. Low maintenance, high return on your cropping. The fruits can be used all sorts of ways. My mother was famous for her blueberry pie because we had some very many blueberries. We had to figure out what to do with them. And the little kids just love them. You haven't lived till you've changed a blueberry diaper a few times. At the lake for a week. Another favorite of mine are figs. Figs are wonderful. Now, my wife can't stand figs. She can't eat. She says they're bland, but I love figs. I've probably got 6 different varieties around where I live. So when I'm walking or mowing, I just grab them. But figs are real easy. I mean, they grow in Palestine, they grow in the Bible lands, so they grow anywhere. If you've got really rich soil, save that for your blueberries. If you've got sort of marginal, rocky, clay, shaly kind of soil, try a fig there. Normally they'll do well. But if you think about your grandparents' figs, they were always next to a wall or outhouse or a barn or something, about 12 feet out where the sun hit, so that you get that reflection of that heat and that sun. And what it does is protecting the buds from the cold in about April. So fig, it's got little buds already. This thing is beginning to bud out just in the backyard of the store today, little tiny things. They're pretty tough, but if you get a really cold spell or a freeze, like that Easter freeze we had about 6 or 8 years ago, it'll knock them off. But if you have it next to a building, but not too close, remember, then you'll do fine. You can plant just one and you get plenty of yield. The reason you plant other figs is to have other harvest windows and other colors and other sizes. Like a Celeste is your smaller fig, like your grandmother put whole in the jars to make the fig that will preserve, whereas the brown turkey is the bigger fig that you threw at your cousins and everybody, and they're big ones to eat. And there are a few other kinds of it as well, but figs are wonderful. Very low maintenance, very low fertilizing needs, and you can, if they get too big, you can take a chainsaw and cut them off the ground if you want. About once every 30 years, you'll get a bad freeze that will kill a fig to the ground, and it'll come right back. when you plant a fig, or if you get a killback like that, it'll send up multiple shoots. Don't let it do that, just leave it to 1 or 2 or 3. You don't want this porcupine coming out of the ground. And you want to prune figs, for instance, where you can still get them under with a mower or a weed eater or something. Not much grows under a fig. It's pretty barren up under there. But if you let them get too high, you want to have a step ladder. You know, we've got some that we let grow down low because the chickens eat them and the birds get the one up here and my grandchildren and we get all the ones in the middle. But figs are great and they'll live for years.
How long does it normally take to get a harvest after you plant, let's say a ground turkey?
2 years. You might get 1 or 2 figs that first year, but the second year you'll start to get some real growth. And probably by the 3rd year, you want to start shaping it to whatever shape and size you want it to be. You can make it flat, you can make it round, you can make it like a wine glass. It's whatever makes it easiest for you to harvest. Question in the back, I'm sorry.
I think that mine is Black Mission. I'm seeming to have a problem with it ripening at the right time.
Right, the question for the online people is a Black Mission fig. I think I brought one just for that purpose. Black Mission is not the one you would want to try. Well, it's probably in the truck. We've got some out there in the truck. Black Mission is probably not the one you want to try starting out with. Your grandparents will say, fig should be black, or fig should be purple, but the brown varieties and the light yellow varieties just do better. It goes back to chilling hours and it goes back to whatever your microclimate is. But I've had that problem with a black one and a purple one. And the only thing you do is just try to move it somewhere else. If you've got a fig or a blackberry or anything or asparagus that you want to move, if this were your plant here, take your sharpshooter shovel and go and chop it all the way around to cut those roots and then leave it for 2 weeks. Let it heal in the ground. And then take your shovel in that same slot and pick it up and move it. And the old timer taught me if this is the south side or the north side or whatever, tie a ribbon on it. So when you move it somewhere else, you're orienting it the same way. Orient it to whatever, towards your barn or whatever. So root prune it, let it heal, and then move it. And you may find that it'll do fine. If you've got some shoots coming out of the ground, you can layer. You know what layering is? So if you've got a fig, or any of these things for that matter, blackberry, raspberry, you strip the branches and leaves off of a stem, and you sort of bend it over and you run it in that hole right there. And then you force it to point up, and you kind of push it down to the ground or put a brick on it or something, and you pack it full of soil. So you've got the mother plant coming in this hole on the side and coming up, stick it up about that far. No branches or anything, just a stick. And pack your compost in there and leave it for half a season or so. And it will completely root inside that pot. And if you're not sure, you can slit it with a knife and you'll say, oh yeah, there are the roots. So then you cut it off from the mother. The stick is here, set it in the shade for a day or two, let the leaves kind of perk back up, and then plant it somewhere else so that you're leaving your Black Mission where it was, but you're moving another one to a new spot. I always try to tell people, try to figure out where in March or April your cat or dog goes and lies when you put them outside. That's where you want to put these things. They know where the ground is warmer and they know where the sun is. As long as it's not too close to your structure, as long as it's not near a driveway, all those kind of things we talked about earlier. Yes, ma'am.
With the fig again, mine's kind of taking a bushy form because I'll do it back to stump leaves them and so it's kind of bushing out instead of having like a center trunk and then coming out above that. Would I consider all of those coming out from this bottom base, the suckers?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So do I want to try to recreate a center?
Yes.
Okay.
The question from all our people, the question was, this lady's fig is suckering a lot up from the ground and it's sort of a, I guess you would call it sort of a wine glass shape. That can be part of the problem. All the energy is going to these suckers. And as we said earlier, if your plant is growing that way, cut off everything you can. And You can either have a central leader, that's one way, that's not the only way to grow a fig, or you can have, I call it a trio, you can have a three-way, but not a 4 or 5 or a 6. And you're just never gonna get as much that way. And they're hard to harvest that way, and it's really hard to prune it when it's a jungle like that. You wanna be able to see through that plant if you can. I know it's probably harder for the online people to understand the layering, but call me on the phone and I can talk to you about it. Question, yes, sir.
Yeah, so ours grows back the last 2 Marches, and then it grows again in that November timeframe. So should we trim it now to cut it back, or do we need to wait until it's ready to start growing?
I'd wait, the question is, there's been some winter damage on this, is it a fig?
Yeah.
This winter damage on this next fig. We all probably had some winter damage when that cold spell hit, was it last year? Just wait and see what it looks like in the spring. I guarantee if you go out and look at it now, you're gonna see some buds on it somewhere. And the beauty of the figs is, you don't even have to know what you're doing. You can hack it any old way you want, and it will still grow. There are some better ways, but a fig is very, very forgiving. So if you're thinking about cutting it, cut it. You're not gonna hurt a thing. If you cut 50% of a fig bush down, it will recover just fine. So, and they respond well to that. You think about these fruits, man has been altering the growth out of some of these fruits for 1,000 years. And obviously the ones that we selected and kept were ones that respond to pruning. You don't exactly go and prune a white oak tree, but you prune an apple or a pear or a pomegranate, any of these, and it excites new growth. So a fig that's as tall as this tree, this root, it could get there, but who can take it? So that's a good point. But on winter damage, always wait and just see what it looks like. Yes, ma'am. Question online?
More big questions. Somebody bought a shrub of a big.
Let's get the garden.
It was 2021.
Uh-huh.
It still has not produced fruit.
The question is, somebody bought a fig a couple, 3 years ago that hasn't produced fruit. Well, I guess unless
A video about it.
it should be producing fruit, but typically, if you haven't gotten a fruit in 3 years, it's time to move it or to start over. Location can make it
Please mute yourself.
probably not a deficiency in the soil. You'd have gotten some fruits. It's probably more of drainage or sunlight or something like that. Do the layering. There's probably nothing wrong with the variety. I would assume it was a locally bought variety. There are varieties that don't do as well here, but I just get another one and start over. Sometimes you get a dud, and it's probably more site driven than it is variety driven. If you ever wonder what varieties to plant of any of this, NC State and Clemson websites are the key, and we're right in the middle between them. University of Georgia has some good information on their website, their cooperative extension, but even some of their varieties are not the same because of chili peppers. So variety choices, just make sure wherever you're getting them, that it's a variety that has done well. Let's see. Pomegranates. Most people now know what a pomegranate is. They think it's something exotic. They actually grow extremely well here. First one I ever saw was my grandmother's yard 60 years ago, but it was exotic then. The pomegranates are very popular. They're simple to grow. There's not much pest problem. It's a little taller. It's a landscape tree that can get 12, 15 feet tall. It's one of those that likes to suffer. So you have to kind of trim it back and train it to a central leader. The blossoms are beautiful. These beautiful red blossoms. You'd be proud to have it in your front yard. They don't require much fertilizer. But the fruits are really cool because they keep so long. When you learn how to pick them, you can put them in we have a walk-in cooler at our farm, we can put them in that cooler and they're good for several months. Or you can shell them out and freeze them. My little granddaughters love them, and my daughter will shell them out and just freeze them and give them to them as snacks. One of the easy ways to shell them out is just in a bowl of water. If you sort of do the shelling in the water, all the white stuff floats to the top and all the little berry parts float to the bottom, and you just pour off it. But again, everybody should have a pomegranate. You can plant just one, you'll get plenty. No spraying
very little fertilizer, and it's attractive. So consider a pomegranate. Brambles are that's our redneck name for blackberries and raspberries and that sort of thing. Everybody knows what wild blackberries are. They're good, you eat them, you get chiggers and all that sort of thing. Well, there's a lot of good research at various universities. Blackberries now are as big as your thumb, and most of the blackberries are thornless. Kids will love it, the wife will love it. Blackberries are great. Some grow upright, some trail on the ground. All of them can stand a little bit of trellising, but if you don't want to trellis, you can just let them flop, just like in the wild. They're about as carefree as blackberries in the wild. Not a lot of fertilizing. We had a patch that 2 or 3 years ago, one of our good, like my brother, this Mexican guy that works for us at the store at the farm, we worked together for almost 30 years. I said, this farm, let's go prune the blackberries, which normally you'll prune the biggest, ugliest stalks. You'll prune about half the plants. He cut the whole patch, cut everything down to a nub. I thought he killed them. Well, they came back with a vengeance the next year, and then the following year, we had the best crop ever. So there's an example of pruning hard makes these plants grow better, and you can't mess up with them. The blackberries that are thornless typically do the best. They're a little seedier than the wild ones. You get them in your teeth a little bit more, but you get a bowl like this will have about 7 berries in it. It's full. Raspberries are not very thorny. They've got a little bit of briars on them, but they are a little more finicky. And when you harvest them, and you've also got to eat them up a little quicker. But if you haven't had backyard raspberries, you haven't had backyard tomatoes. It's that big a difference between what you grow and what you get at the grocery store. And they won't be all moldy like we get in the grocery store. They're red ones, black ones, yellow ones. The red ones tend to do the best in the South. A lot of raspberries don't do well in the South, so don't get your uncle that lives in Ohio to bring you all his raspberry vines that do so well, because they won't do well here. Most of the good raspberries and blackberries are developed by the University of Arkansas, a lot of them are. And some of them have the word pri, P-R-I, or P-R-I-M, arc, A-R-K, like Primark David or something. That's a patented University of Arkansas variety that double crops. It'll grow berries on old stems and new stems. I'm simplifying it, but if you have a chance to buy a variety that's got Primark or Pri-Arc like Arkansas, get it. It's well suited for our climate. Much better than the varieties that we had 15, 20, or 30 years ago. You would kind of grow like a heritage raspberry, and it was sort of hit or miss, but the ones that are out there, very good. A lot of good research. But brambles or blackberries, raspberries, you don't want to leave a patch more than 5 or 10 years in one area, because you'll start to get some disease issues. Actually, some of the same diseases that affect your vegetables. But then it's just a matter of layer them like we talked about, or dig them up and move them 30 feet away and plant something new in that soil. It's pretty simple. All of those blackberries and raspberries do preserve well, but you got to move pretty fast. You need to either make jellies or freeze them or juice them or use them in smoothies or something like that. But post-harvest handling of those, you got to be sort of judicious about it. Any questions so far? Muscadines and scuppernines. Most people probably have heard of those. If you grew up around here, know what they are. They're those thick-skinned grapes that are either purple or sort of bronze or sort of green, sort of big, and you squirt the juice in your mouth and you have to spit the seeds out. And my father's real good. He can spit the seeds back in the hole. I've never had to figure out how to do it. He can eat the grape, and they're all back in the hole, and then he throw it at you. But those are native grapes to the Carolinas. The original scuppernine, which is the green one, is at the Scuppernine River down at Nettie. There's a state park out there that's got this acres of a scuppernine vine that the Indians apparently value highly, and it's still there. Most of the wild ones you find are the purple ones in the woods, and that's the muscat. They're all sort of the same. They're very high in antioxidants. You can make wine out of them. You can do a lot of things, but they're just mostly fun to eat and to throw. And they can stand a little bit of shade. Some of the old timers would actually plant it by a tree and let it grow off a tree, just like it in the woods, and then shake the vine. The common way was an arbor. If you've ever been to your grandparents, they have an arbor in the backyard. They're 4 posts. They got hog wire on top, and they'll put a muscadine on one and scuppernine, and they grow up, and you sit on it because it's usually 2 or 3 or 4 degrees cooler due to evaporative cooling under a grape arbor in the hot summer when you don't have air conditioning, and it smells good. A lot of critters like to eat them. The possums love to get them, but you'll get more than you can possibly eat. My preferred way to grow them is on a trellis. You plant one, and you have some telephone poles with a wire, and you run it 10 or 15 feet that way, and 10 or 15 feet that way. Some are perfect pollinators. You can plant just one. It's always desirable to have a couple varieties. Typically, the quote female varieties get bigger. But you gotta have a standard variety with it. But scuppernines and muscadines are great. You get some Japanese beetles on them. Don't worry about spraying them. They don't kill it, and they don't normally hurt the fruits. They just take off some of the leaves. Yes, a question in the back.
Yes, could you graft a scuppernine or muscadine the way you were talking about a while ago with that pot? If you take a leaf or whatever and stick it up through the hole, can you graft one that way?
The question is, how can you propagate a scuppernine or a muscadine from your neighbors or somebody that's got a good one? Yes, you can layer it. It's not really grafting. Grafting is where you cut 2 plants that are different and stick them together, but you can layer it through a pot. Used to be in the old days, they just put a brick on top, and remember that, and then you have to be pretty quick about catching those roots that go down in the ground and cutting it off from the mother plant before it gets too far along. I like to use the pot because it's very forgiving, but you absolutely can just run one of those through there, and that's the way a lot of these growers propagate those. It's easier than clipping one off and trying to put rooting hormone and that sort of thing. Let the mother plant do all the work. It's like when you're raising chickens, let the abandoned hens settle the eggs. Don't get an incubator. It's too much work. Let Mother Nature help you, but this layering technique can be used on everything that we're talking about here. Not so much on apples and things, but these berries and ribes and these kind of fruits you can layer blueberries. It's a little tricky. I've seen people actually on a blueberry, they'll take a little water bottle, like a pint water bottle, and they'll slit it on the side and put it on here, pack it full of soil and tie it with a string and watch it. And when you see the roots come to the edges of the plastic, you can try it. You're not going to be successful every time, and it's going to take you a year to make it work, but you can do that. Any other questions?
What's the best time of year to do that for a muscadine? Is it fall or spring?
I've tried both. Anytime that I'd say fall or early spring, anytime that it's not got leaves, it's easier to see, it's easier to stuff it up through the pot. And then when it gets its leaves, you want those leaves to be a couple of months old, but you don't want to get a lot of growth. You can put it back, you can cut this thing back that's coming out of this pot. Don't let it get so tall, but you're just looking at the leaves. If they look mature, then when you cut it off from that mother plant, they'll droop for about a day, put it in the shade, you water it, and then you're fine. You can plant it that next day, and it will recover. In a hole that's wider, but not much deeper, like we talked about earlier. Let's see. Japanese persimmons. Most people have now seen those. They're the big persimmons you see in the grocery store, or if you go to the Asian market. They are fantastic. It's another new kid on the block. We looked at, when we first started keeping these things probably 20 years ago, we looked at NC State, Clemson, and they were real sure. They hadn't had a lot of track record with them, but they've done well. There are 2 types. There's astringent and non-astringent. And astringent is kind of bitter, like if you've ever eaten an American persimmon, but it's not quite ripe, and you pick it at the proper time, and then you set it on your counter for about a month. Then it sweetens up just miraculously. It's wonderful in January. A non-astringent you can eat in hand. You can eat off the plant, and they're great too. There are almost no seeds inside, so it's almost all meat. You rarely find a seed. They're pretty big. They're like a small apple, and my wife uses them almost like an apple. You can slice them up and use them in a salad. You can cook with them. they're very useful. If you're not sure about it, go to Asian grocery stores and buy some. I'm sure you probably can still get some now because they do keep so well during the winter. We always harvest ours about Halloween. We harvest them right at frost. And as I said earlier, I don't have much problem with deer, but that's something to try as a Japanese thing. We don't even have any this year. We couldn't get any. They're in such demand. The growers in Georgia, it's a family that we use. They say that, believe it or not, the Chinese and Japanese markets are buying up everything in America that they can, because they plant so many of them there. And a grower can just sell his entire truckload to one buyer and he's done for the season. So that's the kind of the problem. That's what's happened with pecans the last 4 or 5 years. We won't be able to get some pecans sometime, and the grower says there are more pecans planted in China now than in the rest of the world combined. They love pecans for some reason. But most of the Japanese persimmons we get are grafted, meaning they've got a different rootstock. That's what the word you were using back there earlier. They're grafted on a different rootstock for our soils. So they're not as likely to layer as well. You pretty much need to get the tree. You can probably find some online or something, but highly recommend those. Either astringent or non-astringent, it doesn't matter. You can plant 4 or 5 of them, but they don't need a pollinator. American persimmons, which we sometimes have too, are the ones that you see in the woods around here. They're male and female. And if you've got all males and all females, you're not gonna have your persimmons. So typically you gotta plant a cluster of those. You can grow them from the seed. They're great for wildlife. Steve, my friend here, makes the most fantastic American persimmon pudding that is to die for. There's a lot of work. You have to mash it through the nose cone and all that, but American persimmons are good, but mostly deer hunters and wildlife people plant them, and they're very slow growing. But the Japanese ones are just fabulous.
How many of the Japanese trees
They're smaller than, say, a Bradford pear. They're about like a pomegranate. And if you've ever seen roadside plantings of these Japanese plums and some of those, they're sort of that size. I don't normally prune mine. One of mine's probably 20 years old, and that one in my front yard, man, it's not any more than 12, 15 feet tall. So it's not overpowering. And I wouldn't consider it a shade tree. I consider it a landscape tree. It doesn't go out like this where you can put a picnic table on it or something. It's a little more compact. Pretty tree. You can have it in your front yard. Yes, ma'am.
Someone online is asking about Asian pears.
Question is Asian pears. They're a little different than other pears. I have tried growing Asian pears and not had much success. I love those big old Asian pears you can get at the Asian grocery store. Chilling hour and pollination requirements need to be researched pretty well, but they're not as needy as an American pear. But we carried them for a few years at the hardware, and I tried them before we carried them, and I punted after a while. I just didn't get the return on them. The Asian pears also get fire blight, like the American pears, not as badly. Fire blight I even brought some fire blight spray. It's basically an antibiotic, but fire blight affects pears a lot. Not as much the Asians, but it does get them, and it got mine, the ones I had growing. So I just opt to buy the Asian pears at the Korean grocery store or the Asian grocery store, and they're wonderful. But if it's a high maintenance or requires a lot of spraying, that's just not my philosophy. And I think for you all, you would only attempt that after you have managed to do well with these other. It's a very good question. I think goji berries, we've talked a little bit. I think I've got a sample here. It's a very small, it can be grown in a container, very small bush. It helps to have two. It just seems to help with the pollination. And you're going to pick those things and you're going to put them in a smoothie, or you're going to mix them with something that's sweeter, because they're not terribly sweet, but they are a real superfood or health food. I've grown some 4 or 5 different times, and I've never found pests to be a problem or squirrel. I don't think they know what they are, the deer or anything else. I don't think they know to try to eat them. Got to keep going here. I'm going to talk quickly about citrus, and then we will stop for Q&A. We talked briefly about citrus. excellent choice. If you're limited on space, you've got a way that you can roll a container in and out. It's a kind of a class of its own. The only time you'll ever get much insect, you might get scale sometime, or you might get a little bit of mildew. You gotta remember that these things crop sometimes twice a year, so there's not gonna be much spraying other than neem, NEEM, or pyrethins, because you don't wanna be eating that stuff. They break down quickly, and if you get white flies, you can just put a little sticky trap in there to catch them. But if you're not set up to get them in and out, you're not gonna be very successful. As I said, one of the ones we've got at work, an old customer of mine had it for years, and he got too old to manage it. He said, "Hey, come get my lemon tree." So we've probably had it 15 years. It's an old tree, and we've pruned it multiple times, but it never fails. It lets us have so many lemons, and we have to tell customers, "Can I have one of your lemons?" We say, "Oh, they're not ripe for 2 more months." And then over Christmas, they all disappear. We pick them all. We give them to each other for family. Everybody wants to steal the lemon. We have cameras. We watch people steal the lemons. They're that good. But they are wonderful. The zest is just great. The juice, my wife and my daughter, my sister, they put them in ice cube trays. Some of these ice cube trays have little tiny holes in them, so you can have just a little piece and you melt it and mix it with olive oil and make your salad dressing. I've had some customers that have made limoncello, the Italians drink with lemon and, I don't know what it is, vodka or something, I'm not sure what it is, but I highly recommend you try some lemons, and it's a great pet. And then if you can't take care of it, give it to someone. Question, yes, ma'am.
I was also looking at the key lime. There's a key lime,
Mhm.
green key limes. Have you done anything?
I'm doing some of those, and
Repeat the question.
there, ma'am.
Repeat the question.
No, that's right. The question is key limes, the little green key limes. I've got some that are probably about 5 years old now, and I'm not quite sure yet if it's gonna be sort of customer friendly, but absolutely try it. They're useful. But not everybody knows how to use a key lime. Everybody knows how to use a lemon, and the lemons are just so nice and big. The key limes are sort of small. They're more difficult to know when to pick. But all of these smaller citrus do well. I've got a little greenhouse in my backyard that's probably 14 feet square, and I've got a natural gas line where I can keep it 32 degrees, 33 degrees over really cold. And I put them in there in the winter, but I open the doors and the windows during the day so the bees can get in. And it's almost intoxicating when you go in there because of the smell. It's just wonderful. But it's pretty hard to lift them out, and then I leave them out all summer. But probably the better one I found that I got from another customer that I didn't even know what it is. It's a little sort of a bitter orange, and it makes marmalade better than you can find in England. It's just incredible orange marmalade. My daughter makes it. I haven't ever made it, but it's really good. So if you're interested in citrus, try it. But if you're limited in space, lemon is going to give you hands down the best yield. If you got a little greenhouse and you can eat it, key lime is definitely worth trying. Good question. And there are others. The little, I don't know if it's a loquat or a kumquat. It's a little thing that's shaped sort of a teardrop. It looks almost like one of those red cherry tomatoes that's sort of long. You eat it, peeling and all, seeds and peeling. Fantastic. It's the kind of thing you used to get in your stocking when you were a kid at Christmas. You never got citrus any other time of year. Yes, ma'am.
How long does it take till they start blooming and producing?
The ones we get that are this size, you'll have a lemon on it next year. You might have one or two, and it'll be real heavy.
Well, I have when I started with seed, but it's been 5 years now. I don't have any blooms.
You can't start on seeds. You don't know what you're gonna have. Has it got thorns on it?
No.
Well,
It keeps producing.
I've never found many people that have been successful at starting one from seed.
Okay.
Yeah, these are all clones. These are cuttings. Our mother plant, we used to have a retired county agent in Mecklenburg that would come and he would take cuttings off of our mother plant and root them in his little greenhouse. He could make us 100 cuttings off of it. Then you know what the plant's gonna be like. It's a clone. So, find somebody that's got one and you can try rooting. It's a pretty slow process. You could probably layer it like we're talking. They're not grafted, but starting from seed, you don't know what you're gonna get. Great question. Because a lot of things you can grow from seed. you'll never get a decent apple from seed. You might get 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 20, but then you gotta wait 10 years to know whether you got a decent apple. So you use scions, you take cuttings, you take pieces of that and graft it or root it or something so that you know what you got. Yes, ma'am, another internet question?
Yeah, someone has a 4 to 5-year-old, lemon tree that is 3 feet tall, not producing.
Hard to say. Sometimes you get a dud. If it was indeed started from a plant, that was a cloned plant, you might pull it out of the pot when the ground's sort of dry and heavily root prune it. Just take your clippers and just cut about half of the roots. You're not gonna hurt it. The bigger roots, obviously, and pot it again in a bigger pot this next time with maybe 2 or 3 more inches of capacity of soil, compost around it. And I have found that people wonder why their lemons aren't producing. I say, well, how often do you feed it? Well, I'll never feed it. And when it's in a container, there's nowhere it can get food other than that soil, and it gets depleted very rapidly, just making foliage and just making stems. So you use citrus tone or plant tone, you use an organic food about once a month, because it's like having a bird in a cage. If you don't feed it, it ain't gonna do much, whereas the chicken out in the wild can kind of fend for itself. So containerized plants take a lot more food than you think. And you gotta remember that fertilizer is kind of like Kool-Aid. It's sort of water soluble. So when you water a plant, a lot of that nutritional value is washing out the bottom. Not all, but a lot. So feeding it, root pruning it, potting it up. And then if that doesn't work, put it by the curb and let somebody, put free and let somebody take it away so you don't have to keep it. And start with another one. Good question though. Yeah.
Hardy kiwi.
Question about hardy kiwis. I don't have a lot of experience with that. I've tried hardy kiwis and failed at it. I think they're cool. I think there's potential there. We have a salesman that brings us for Christmas sometimes a box of hardy kiwi from St. John's Island down below Charleston, and they're fabulous, but they've got a lot of different climate. You got male and female there again, and they're not nearly as big as you think the big kiwis are. If you got room, I think it's worth a try. They are a nice landscape plant. You can actually sort of have a trellis, but my luck with it was not so good. Again, I like to experiment, but whatever produces without a lot of work wins with me. Good question. I think I've covered everything here. I'll take more questions. I want to talk about a couple of these crops that I've brought that hasn't come up in the conversation. This is a white plant blanket. A lot of you are familiar with it. Remade cloth, plant cloth. It's just a frost protection blanket. Often used on blueberries when it's cool or when it's cold in the spring. But remember, you put a blanket on babies because babies put off heat and you're trying to keep that heat. Plants don't put off heat. The only reason you would put a blanket on a plant is either to let the frost land on the blanket and not on the foliage, or you wrap it all the way to the ground and try to trap some of that ground heat. A frost guard like this works a lot better on a strawberry bed than it does a big old tall blueberry or a tomato plant, because you're not trapping any heat. Sometimes you can use these to protect them from sun scald. There are all sorts of reasons, but we get people all the time saying, I'm going to cover my plants, or I'm going to cover it with a sheet. Well, unless you're going to put a light bulb under there, you're not doing much. You're gonna just fail. But if you can get it all the way to the ground and weight it down, and then use clothespins to attach the blanket to the tree or to the tomato bush or to the lemon or whatever, because at night the wind whips up and in the morning you look out and your plant blanket's all torn away. It's like your baby came out of the blanket. So frost guards are good, but they're not guaranteed unless you really understand how they work and how trapping ground heat works. This is a little tape. It's a roll of tape. It's like a CD. It just flashes everywhere. It's called scare tape. This is cool stuff. It'll about blind you on a summer day. If you got birds tearing up your fig bushes, mockingbirds particularly, you can hang this tape or you can hang CDs, but nobody likes to CDs anymore. It's really good for keeping crows out of corn. If you've got corn rows, you just take a few rods and put this stuff out and it just drives the crows crazy. They just sit up in the tree and yell at you. But it is a good scare tape for birds. It doesn't do as much for the deer, but, birds can be a problem right when the berries are ripe. And then netting, we talked about netting, comes in all different shapes and sizes, big enough to cover a big tree. The holes are pretty small, but you can't net too quickly or the branches grow through it. There's also heavier netting that you put up for deer, 7 feet tall, 100 feet long. Kind of like the snow fence, but it's black and it's smaller. You almost can't see it. If you had it on that wall, you couldn't see it. So your neighbors wouldn't complain, but it's tough. It's a lot tougher than this. And you have to use about 8-foot fence posts to keep it in, but you can make a corral for your deer. And then in one place, you just have a little opening and you just use a bungee cord to kind of attach it to itself. You don't have to make a gate or anything. But mechanical ways of keeping the pests away or the frost away or the birds work well. And you should use that as part of your toolbox. Yes, sir.
The, frost one, I'm not sure what you call that, the crossbar, I have a peach tree, and last year when we had frost in May, plus killed off most of my blooms, that would be a good idea to cover.
Wouldn't help probably. It's called a frost guard, not a freeze guard. If your air temperature got to 31 or 30 or 29, even for a couple of hours, it got your peach blossom. Have you ever heard a peach farmer that's happy? All they do is complain about it because it's a tough looking growth. They like to bloom early to get going, but then we have cold. This will keep frost off. So you can have frost at 34, 35, 36 degrees, and absolutely it will protect those blossoms. Put it on, use clothespins. Don't let the wind get under. Try to do it right before you go to bed because the wind does pick up. But you're not trapping any heat. You're just having a place for the frost to land. If you go out in your backyard, sometimes you'll see part of your roof has got frost on it and part of it doesn't. It's just a weird thing how frost can move around. It doesn't have to be 32 degrees, but you're not gonna ever protect a peach tree from freezing unless you light these smudge pots like peach farmers do and you sprinkle it. Now you can run your water hose and you can spray water and let it freeze on those branches and freeze on those blossoms. And 32 is better than 29, and it usually will work. That's why peach farmers have to spend half the night fighting. Yes, ma'am, question in the back. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't repeat that question. I'll do it next time for the all about future. I'm not used to this online stuff. I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. One was about whether you say about the goji berries,
Mhm.
and that's just like a tree or what. And the other was, is there anything at all that is good? I don't know, a little more of a wooded area, like occasional flooding.
2 questions for the online people, a little more detail about goji berries, and then is there something that is better for a woodland area that it can be prone to some flooding? The pawpaws that we talked about earlier would probably do okay there. Sometimes you can find a blueberry that will do well, not so much for the flooding, but will do pretty well in the woodland area. It'll look nice, it'll have a few berries, it won't be a lot. But if you've ever hiked the Appalachian Trail or gone through the Uwharrie or somewhere, you'll find blueberry bushes. We always call them huckleberries, they're sort of wild ones. You'll find them growing there and you'll get enough to eat and enough to feed wildlife. But after that, you're really more towards planting woodland plants. And woodland plants are not necessarily fruiting plants. They're more nuts, hickory, white oak, that sort of thing, or some of the medicinal herbs, comfrey, those kinds of things. So I think the very first thing I mentioned was sun. Yeah, I think my first line was, you gotta have sun for what we're talking about here. Orchards are not grown in the woods. It's like farmers don't grow hay except out in the open. It's just a requirement. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Now is a good time to move blueberries and blackberry plants.
they're not in a good range.
Sure, yeah. The question is, can you move blueberry and blackberries now? Sure, they're dormant. Use the method we talked about, sort of root prune it, give it a few days or a week or two to rest. There is a real good hormone. It's sort of a natural occurring hormone that you can come in a bottle like this, you mix it up with water, and you can put it on the cut part of the root, and sort of water it in with that. That works well. It's a root stimulator. But absolutely, you can move them now. You can about move them any time of year if you can keep them from getting too dry, and if you can keep them from being stressed by really high heat. But certainly, this is a good time to move them. Good question. Yes, Cameron?
That, the tape
Mm-hmm.
that reflects, does that, prevent hawks?
I don't know. About chickens, I hadn't thought about that. The question is, will this scare tape or this reflective tape stop hawks? I hadn't thought about that. I'd sure like to figure out a way to keep hawks from killing my
I've
chickens.
heard if you name the CDs, that does the same thing. You mentioned that. so-
Yeah, so the question is, will reflective light? I have not ever thought about that because I'm never home when the hawks kill my chickens. My wife will come and say, hey, just lost another one.
After the day.
But the problem is the chickens are everywhere. I mean, they're all over our property, so you can't hang this stuff everywhere. And then if they're in our pen, then it's already got a cover, so I guess that's why I've never thought about that. But I love to make the pros mad. If they just holler and carry on, they don't like it at all. Great question, though, Cameron. Yes, ma'am.
Is now a perfect time to do pecans, if you have a shoot, can you replant those now?
I'm sorry.
Pecans,
Is now a time to replant a pecan on this question? Are you saying to
you
try?
got shoots like under a tree, and you want to.
I don't know how successful you would be with digging up shoots. Most pecans are grafted. Almost all are. Now, you'll get what's called a seedling pecan, and it'll be great. It'll just be smaller. We've got a seedling pecan in the Matthews Farmers Market. It's been there about 30 years, and it makes great one. It came up wild from a seedling. It wasn't a shoot. It came up from, I remember when it came up about 40 years ago, it came up from that. You'd probably be better off trying to grow from one of your nuts, like a squirrel, than from a shoot. I think if you were going to try that shoot, you'd need to layer it like we talked about. You need to come in the bottom of a pot, run it up, pack it full of soil, and then if you think it's rooted, by taking a knife and cutting down the side, you're gonna have to kind of pull the pot over, take an axe and cut that shoot. It'd be worth a try. And if it's not a grafted tree, it would come true. It would be a clone of that tree. But even 50 years ago, when your grandparents were planting pecans, they're generally grafted. If you look carefully at the trunk as it's coming out of the ground, you can see the graft. But you can certainly grow a seedling pecan. It's one of our native fruits in North America. They're unique to North America originally. So it'd be worth a try. They get big. Gotta have a lot of room. So, hands up there. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
We have a peach tree that looks like two varieties grafted together. Half the tree produces pretty good fruit, the other half produces quarter size and never ripen.
So the question is, he's got a peach tree that's probably one of these that was, you get out of a magazine that's got 2 or 3 different varieties grafted together, maybe 2 of them size. One has decent fruits, one has smaller fruits. It's really more a function of what the original stock was. It could be that part of that tree is, some peaches are grafted. It could be that you've actually got a piece of root stock that has grafted, come out there. That's probably not possible, probably, but it can be that you've got some contamination from rootstock. I would, if it got to be a problem, I'd just cut off that other side all the way back to the parent so that your new branches that came out would be the other one, because typically peaches don't have to have too much variation to have pollination. A lot of peach varieties, you can plant one peach and you'll get something, but it could be that that's the necessary pollinator for the other half. So I'd kind of watch it experiment. Are they always that way every year, little and big?
Yeah, we've never had any decent size on that apple tree.
Well, maybe just minimize it. Do they blossom at the same time?
No, one's after the other.
So you may be getting, the second side may require a pollinator. It does happen. And if they're not blooming at the same time, you're not getting the honeybee action at the same time. So probably planting an additional peach near them might solve the problem. And as I say, some peaches are grafted and some aren't. A lot of them are just named varieties. You could even take a peach pit and grow it. I've done that before. We've got a little peach where we, at our little farm, I call it the Rosalind peach because my granddaughter's name is Rosalind. And they ripen every day on her birthday, which I can't remember. Is August 20th? What's her birthday? I can't remember. But I know when her birthday is because the peaches are ripe. They're little small ones. They're really good. They're sweet, and they never get the disease. So that we don't ever spray them or anything. And it just was a lucky one that just came up. So you can beat this disease issue if you just have time to experiment. That's what breeders do. That's what people spend their entire career trying to figure out how to beat Mother Nature. I just try to learn to let Mother Nature do all the work that she can for me in my little world. When is her birthday anyway?
16.
16th. I was close. But that's when the Rosalind peach ripens. You have any questions? Yes, ma'am. One on the internet?
Yeah, going back to pigs, somebody has a 5-foot, pig that looks like a porcupine now, about 5 feet tall. What should you do? What do I do with my pig already grew like a porcupine, already 5-ish feet tall?
If you've got a 5-foot tall porcupine fig, you need to make it a unicorn. You need to cut off everything but 1 or 2 of those vertical sticks. It will not hurt the plant at all. If you're gonna leave 2, try to get 2 that are facing away from each other, sort of in a V shape, and cut off all that water spout or those sprouts and just see what happens. It probably will recover and make some blossom or make some figs this year. But I've never seen a fig do very well that has multiple sprouts in proportion to its size. If it looks like a porcupine, that's not what it should look. A very good question.
And, if one, this is another question, but looks healthy, no winter damage, but has many suckers, should they be cut now or wait?
Yes, cut them now. Go out there right now with the flashlight. Always try to cut them when it's dormant if you can. You can cut a fig in the summer, but by cutting them now, you're gonna let the rest of the ones that stay realize that, hey, I'm gonna be able to make figs this year.
So is it all live still that cutting them encourages them to grow?
They grow. You just gotta cut them.
Okay.
It encourages the remaining parts to grow.
Okay, got it.
But if it gets killed all the way back, or you cut it back, like if the winter kills it, it's gonna send up multiples. So you've got to thin it to just 1 or 2. But that was the question was, if you cut it, does it encourage it to grow? To a whole lot of people. Anytime you're cutting a plant, it's going to encourage it to grow. But what you're trying to encourage is growth on the remaining part. Yes, ma'am. The back.
I have a dwarf apple that has been in the ground for like about 4 years. And I guess the fall of 2019. And it produces some apples. We got like 11 last year, but it is not growing. The handful of branches that are on there seem stunted. They are not sending out new shoots each year. I have a second apple tree, another dwarf that has only been in the ground 2 years, and it's 4 feet long, re-branched from last year. This one is nothing. This is not sending out new shoots.
You got it good. I've experienced that, and I don't know that there's much you can pick. Oh, the question is, she's got 2 dwarf apple trees. One is growing pretty healthily, and one's not. And they're both the same age at 4 or 5 years old. They're fitting, and there's probably not even a distance between them that's appreciable. Whatever the grower was, whatever the rootstock was, there are lots of kinds of rootstocks. And if it's not an appropriate rootstock for the top part, again, it's complicated. It also, chilling hours we've talked about, that has something to do with the growth. It has more to do with the fruiting, but if it's not an appropriate variety for the Piedmont, Do you remember the names of the two varieties?
One is, I believe the one that is stunted is Red Delicious, and then the other one is, I believe, either Fuji or Piedmont.
Those do all right here. Red Delicious will do better here than Pink Lady or Fuji.
And that's the one that seems to be stunted, the Red Delicious. So I'm concerned if there's some root bound for some way, like maybe we didn't make the hole big enough. I just don't know
Well,
what symptoms we.
I've seen trees that were planted that the plant was root bound and the roots were sort of circular. When you took it out of the pot, it was older. And they don't recover very well from that. You could dig it up, hard root put it back. It's not gonna be hard to dig up. Remember the method I talked about, cutting it. Get it out of the ground, wash the dirt off. Don't let any circular action happen. A lot of times you'll see shrubberies that people plant and the landscapers never took the wire off or the burlap off, and it's constricted. That can happen, so that's a possibility. Did y'all plant them?
We did.
But you just don't remember.
Yeah, I don't remember 4 years ago, what we did, because that was the first one we planted, as the oldest.
Well, you've got time tonight to get him to go out and dig that thing up. So the online question, people, for the online people, the question was, could it possibly be root bound or something wrong with the roots? That's certainly a possibility. When you buy a plant in a container and you pull it out, look at those roots. And if there's some circling going on, clip them. You don't need that. You need it to go out like an azalea. They need to go out. That's probably your best chance is to lift that one and plant it a little higher than it is now and severely cut those roots, cut 30% of them at least. That's a great question too. Questions, anything? Yes, I'm in the back.
The lemon tree that was 4 or 5 years old, not producing, they came back and said it has thorns. What does that mean?
Typically, the ones that have thorns were either started from seed or are not a true Meyer type lemon. I've got one lemon that's thorny in my greenhouse that I talked about. I don't know what kind it is. An old man gave it to me. I got these old men giving me all their fruits, but I guess they think I'm fruity. I've never had a whole lot of luck with my thorny ones, and they're really aggravating. So if you don't know where the bush came from, it's hard to say. But the thorny ones I have found flower at slightly different times, and it's very important to be able to get the bees to them, and their flowering is usually January or February. And if you're not getting many honeybees, you're not going to get many fruits, and it's not going to grow a lot. I have, when I've got a couple of those big thorns, and they're big, when they're too much of a pain, I just clip them off. Because I want to be able to reach in behind there to get the kumquats or something. Lemons can be finicky, but not nearly as much so if you start with a cloned plant that is off of a mother plant that's been produced. Like Christmas trees are pretty much all cloned, you know, all these Fraser firs you see everywhere. That's why they all look the same and they grow the same. They're not wild. Yes, Karen.
What do you recommend in terms of mulching? Because like mulching of your fruiting trees, is it by planting and I put compost in, you know how our rains come, they'll just all wash away. So I want to put a little bit of mulch. Then a lot of people say do the donut method and don't put the mulch right up against the trunk. But then when you get some of these crazy rains, 3 inches, then you're basically creating like a pool right over the trees. So I get, it's like a lose-lose. I mean, yeah.
For the online people, the question is mulching. How do you decide whether to mulch or not mulch when you get these heavy rains, or if you use the donut method where you're mulching like a tire around it? As a rule, these kind of plants we're talking about don't need much mulch. You prepare the ground when you plant it correctly. The only mulch you would want to maybe use is some leaves. For whatever reason, leaves don't wash away like pine bark or pine needles or anything. Leaves, they fall and they sort of mat down. Our blueberries at the lake, all we do is just take a leaf blower, blow a few leaves around them. Mulching works well on flat ground for ferns and perennials and rosemaries or something like that. But these kind of bushes, they're kind of close to being wild. They don't need much mulch, because you're going to run the risk of keeping the ground too wet. And also a mulch is like a blanket. It keeps the soil cool in the spring, whereas you really need the sun to start to warm the soil in the spring. You mulch something like lettuce or broccoli so that you keep in that cool ground cool for another week or two, so you can have a little more harvest. But generally on these kind of things, you don't want that ground to warm up in the spring and start to get hot, because they're gonna bud out. I mean, this little pomegranate is already leaking out. So it's thinking spring is coming. So typically mulching is not nearly as important as drainage and as using organic fertilizer, feeding them when they're beginning to come out of the dormancy. They're like a baby, they need food. And it's either compost or fertilizer, but you can do more damage with mulch, particularly if you pile it up around the trunk of whatever it is, because that part is supposed to be out in the open in the wind, in the air, and the sun, so you don't just rot. That's a good question, though, because your instinct is to baby them. You don't want to baby these things, you just won't let Mother Nature help them. Questions? Laurie, you got a question? Y'all got a question? I'm gonna make the question.
Can you prune pomegranate now?
Sure, yeah, you can prune the pomegranate, that, you don't have to do a lot of pruning, but you want to keep it in a nice shape, and you want to stop those sprouts from coming up. And generally, you want to prune a pomegranate high enough that you can get your lawnmower under it and knock the hat off of your glasses.
He's asking, should it be the 1 to 3 trunks like big? 1 to 3 trunks like big?
Yes, maybe 1 to 2. Even a central leader on the pomegranate would be fine, but not 3 or 4, because they tend, also in an ice storm, they'll tend to break. They're a little bit fragile in that regard. We don't get many ice storms, but it can happen. Kaylee, you got a question? Can you make up one? She's our youngest one here. She's one of the smartest too.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dave.
Okay.
And thank Matt here, he helped with,
Matt has designed some sort of a raffle.
he has.
Okay, I'm gonna let him explain. So somebody's gonna go home with some of these things.
And Matt, tell them they get to get their choice of what's up here, is that correct?
Yeah, so for everyone who entered their email to be added on the newsletter that we send out every Tuesday, we've drawn a name out of the jar, and it is.
Laura Holtquist? Did I say it right? Yes. Okay.
So if you come up after.
Thank you. If y'all would like